Welcome to FO Talks. With me is Thomas Barfield again. He's a professor, he is a great scholar on Afghanistan. And today we are going to discuss Afghanistan again. In fact, today uh, Thomas is going to answer the question: is the Taliban ruled Afghanistan now becoming a normal state? Because, of course, we are seeing all kinds of headlines. And the BBC has been covering Afghanistan again recently. The story why India is reaching out to the Taliban was on the global front page. Note, India has no love lost for the Taliban. The memory of the 1999 Kandahar hijacking still burns strong. So the photo of Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri meeting the Taliban acting foreign minister Amir Khan Muttaqi in Dubai is a big deal. So, Thomas, are we seeing finally a normalization of the Taliban-ruled Afghanistan?
Well, I don't think we are. We're seeing game playing with Afghanistan, but we're not seeing normalization. As you said, India has no love for the Taliban, but it has even less love for Pakistan. And once a regime that Pakistan backed bites Pakistan, that's going to attract Indian attention regardless of who's there. I don't think there's any trust there, but it is one of those, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, at least for the moment. So India's interest is understandable. Also, India invested a lot and still investing in infrastructure in Afghanistan, uh, opening up to Afghanistan via Charbahar, the Iranian port, which took away the leverage of Pakistan and being the only route to the sea. So India also has an interest in terms of being able to get into Central Asia via Afghanistan. So there are a number of reasons why they could be talking. The interesting thing is that neither India nor China nor any other country that's been going through the routines of sort of normalizing relationships has been unwilling to give the Taliban regime diplomatic recognition, which
What
would seem,
about Pakistan?
and Pakistan should have been the first, but now they won't because their demands were recognize the Duran line, get rid of the Tariqa-Taliban. And no surprise to people who have watched Afghanistan, the Taliban said, thank you for 20 years of help, but we can take it for ourselves at the moment. And you know what? We've never much liked Pakistan. Uh, this Pakistan should have seen that coming. And there's a lot of Pakistani military and intelligence officials still working with the Taliban inside Afghanistan. So they're in a
So
bit of
the ISI, the dreaded Inter-Services Intelligence.
they are, but the problem is if you're thinking in terms of grand strategy, all of your tactical victories appear to have led to a strategic defeat, and that has to be galling.
I see. Countries are operating in Afghanistan, though. Qatar is involved, the Chinese have business interests, and even the World Bank is trying to do some projects. So, mm, in
That's
some,
the interesting thing is
yeah,
that relations with Afghanistan seem to be normalizing,
yeah,
but working around the Taliban regime. And
I
that's
see.
why it's really unusual in a way. This is not North Korea that's isolated itself from the world. The Taliban is keen to reach out to the world, if only to get money flowing. Um, and it's been let through the back door, but nobody's willing to answer the front door. And
Mhm. So, no regime has recognized the Taliban government as yet, not a
that's
single
really
one.
surprising. Three countries did. The
Mhm,
first Taliban regime, Pakistan, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, even
mhm.
though the latter two quickly dropped their recognition or pulled their embassy out when they had trouble with the Taliban. But yeah, it's quite interesting because even more than the 1990s, the Taliban controls all of Afghanistan. They didn't in the 1990s. Um, and you know the government they replaced collapsed. But the normal diplomats will say that, well, we don't have to like a government to recognize it. It's rather surprising, given the years that have now gone by, that no country will do it. I think one of the problems now is no country wants to be the first.
Aha, aha, aha. Now, now, Uzbekistan is supplying electricity to
Yes,
Afghanistan,
yes, it
and
is.
are they getting paid for it?
As my understanding, there's a couple $100 million in arrears. Of course,
Right.
those arrears were from the last government too. Um,
Okay,
but to electricity, you can't like put it in the bank and spend it later. So it's one of those things. If you've got hydropower and other things, use it. Otherwise, you're going to lose it. And I think it buys a certain amount of goodwill. The
mm,
Central Asian republics are not keen to see trouble on their border. I think they may be putting certain pressure on the Taliban not to allow, like the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan and others, to cause trouble. That's purely speculation, but I
mhm.
think the electricity probably buys some goodwill there in terms of preventing jihadists from moving north across the border. They certainly attempted to move the various Uyghur resistance groups away from the border. They didn't throw them out of the country, but they did recognize that China was not happy to see them there.
I see. So, um, so for all practical purposes, life is carrying on as usual. So, why does the Taliban even need recognition? The Talibs
Well,
don't. They are fine. They're ruling the country. Everyone is dealing with them.
but they're not fine because the entire national bank assets are frozen in
Mm,
Switzerland. There's potentially about $9 billion there. Um,
I see.
the the type of aid that they could get through the UN and others, if they were members of the UN and a member nation, would be easier. So there are a number of things they can get without being a recognized government, but there are quite a number that they can't get. And I think if you're talking about trade or other things, it's difficult to negotiate trade agreements if your government is not considered the recognized government of the country. It's the Taliban have been so always domestic oriented that this does not bother them as much as others. But the fact that the country for so long and even now is dependent upon outside aid, um, they'd be in a much stronger position to negotiate for that aid, for increasing in aid, if they were a recognized government. And Afghan economy is in a very, very bad way right now. And there's a question at a certain point, as de Tocqueville pointed out, revolutions do not happen when people are truly miserable because they're too busy just trying to live. But at a certain point, um, either things get better or the misery becomes normal and they begin to wonder, why are we putting up with this? It's not necessarily a conscious kind of thing. And if you're the Taliban or something, just reading the news or listening to the radio, you've watched
Or
series,
if you're listening to us, if you're the
or they
Taliban
could listen,
foreign minister,
they
you're
could
listening to
they could
us.
listen to us. But the fact is, literally within the past 6 months, one of the superpowers of the region, Iran, has seen all of its clients practically collapse. If you're the Taliban, you do really worry as to things can change fast. Um, and therefore the confidence that the world will continue on just as it has always been. Um, just look at the United States. We've got Trump. God knows what's going to happen there. But it's a
Oh,
very
it'll be
dodgy
glorious. He
situation.
will make America great again, Thomas.
Well, then he has to admit that it wasn't great. Okay. Like, it's unfortunately seems to be looking back to the 1870s for when greatness was. All right. Um, you know, it's he has a very 19th century view of power. And he may be surrounded by tech billionaires, but he lives in the age of the telegraph.
Okay. Uh, Going back to Afghanistan, the Taliban should worry. And you wrote a recent white paper um, on Afghanistan, and I read it with interest and concern. And you point out four alarming developments. Number one, Taliban rule has emerged as the most significant domestic threat to the human security and prosperity. of Afghanistan's citizens. Number two, the Taliban's external relations have undermined regional peace and stability for all of its neighbors, including Pakistan. Number three, the threat of Afghanistan's territory becoming an epicenter for global terrorism is growing again. Number four, the Taliban is increasingly dependent on narcotics trafficking, heroin production, and methamphetamine uh, processing, despite its suppression of raw opium cultivation, as reported by the UN in June 2023. So, what happens next?
Well, what it means is we were talking about is the Taliban regime is becoming a normal state. As long as the United States was there, the regional powers, Pakistan in particular, Iran, Russia, China, they did not like the United States being there, but effectively the United States was making the region safe because it was a status quo power. Nothing bad was going to come out of Afghanistan. And when that regime fell, it turns out that there's potential problems for all of its region, particularly for the Afghan people themselves, who are now suffering under the Taliban. Women can't work, they can't go to school. The economy is pretty much collapsed. The country lives on humanitarian food donations. So it turns out, yes, the war is over, but the misery of the Afghan people has only increased. So that's a problem. But if we look at regional politics, Afghanistan has become a problem, not for the United States, which lives far away, but for the actual countries that live there. Iran is having to deal with a huge number of refugees that are either going into Iran or they're heading off to Europe and they're causing problems. Pakistan has the biggest problem because the Taliban are supporting terrorists. What are they going to do with their brigade of suicide bombers? They're sending them to Pakistan. So suddenly, what Pakistan thought is they would have a stable friend in Kabul, and what Pakistan has always called strategic depth, it's not there. In fact, it's a problem. Central Asian republics also begin to look at this and worry about any kind of instability. China sees it as an opportunity, but China is always fearful of instability, and Afghanistan is unstable, and in particular, it harbors international terrorists. The Taliban themselves are probably not an international danger because they're totally focused on Afghanistan. But not since the 1990s have we seen, so many different groups move to Afghanistan, and particularly the Islamic State, which is an enemy of the Taliban, have international goals. So it's created an unstable situation that could get worse. And again, as long as the United States was there for the 20 years, that didn't happen. So when we're looking at it, it causes problem for the region. It's true the Taliban did manage to end opium production, except in the northeast of the country, but they also had a huge reserve. So one of the questions is, Canada has a huge reserve of maple syrup. If you stop tapping maple trees for a year, it's not going to hurt how much syrup Canada exports. The same kind of thing is it actually increases the price of raw opium that people had stored. So to one extent, one wonders, are they driving the price up? The methamphetamine, that's new. It turns out ephedra, was unaware of this. Apparently the basic ingredient of amphetamines actually grows wild in Afghanistan. So
I didn't know that.
yeah, so it turns out, maybe they can, just like their opium, market it as organic, unlike fentanyl, don't get your drugs coming from some lab when they can be hand-picked and hand processed. But nevertheless,
It's a great marketing line. It's a great marketing tagline. Maybe there's a future for you outside academia, Thomas.
Well, when I retire, I can take it up. No, the bigger thing is if Afghanistan had been admitted into the Convention of Opium Growing Countries, they could use that. You know, Turkey, India, Australia, they're all big exporters and they're part of the cartel. Afghanistan was never part of the cartel. But if we look at it, one of the things we can see is that Afghanistan is still a problematic place in terms of drug production. So when we look at this, any one of those would be an international problem. But I think the biggest one is the fact that there's so many ungoverned terrorist groups inside the country that could do something bad anywhere in the world that could have repercussions. This is what brought the Taliban down, in 2001. They had no intention of attacking New York or Washington, but Al-Qaeda did. And I think that's true of quite a number of other groups in the country, is that the Taliban have no means of supporting them. But if something bad happens, they're going to find themselves in the crosshairs again.
Indeed. So can another 9/11 type attack occur?
I would say that it's possible. I mean, the world is on guard more. More difficult to do something in the United States, simply because it's far away, and the United States is hypersensitive to that. But we have seen attacks in Europe via the Islamic State. India has, I think, a lot to worry about from this because it's much closer, and many of these groups have targeted India. China has not really been targeted from groups in Afghanistan, but China worries about it, and given their policies in Xinjiang, they have every reason to worry about it because they've sort of defined terrorism as Islamic, and it's one of those things that it's possible to produce a situation that wouldn't have occurred if you hadn't pushed it. And the oppression of Uyghurs in Xinjiang certainly gives an opening for Islamic groups to say that they're doing in the defense of the people there that actually, were not involved in something like this before.
So let me ask you another question. What are the models for the Taliban regime?
Well, the Taliban regime, I think, has a number, if you will, almost of counter models because they consider themselves an Islamic state run by Sharia law. On the other hand, they don't have a governing model for that. So they've got leftover models in Afghanistan, a lot of which, Afghans borrowed from the Turks to some extent earlier on in their modernization period, that they borrowed from the Soviets, that they borrowed from the Americans.
What about their neighbors, Iran and Pakistan? Have they borrowed from both Iran and Pakistan?
Not in their governing sense, they really haven't, because neither of those countries has offered money or development aid. India has has produced more aid inside Afghanistan than Pakistan ever did. That's one of Pakistan's weaknesses, is that it cannot compete economically with either India or Iran. And so it has a problem there in terms of sort of peacetime developments. And it also has a problem in terms of trade going back and forth, what's considered smuggling. So they really haven't borrowed. And in particular, the one thing Afghanistan has not had in its past is a military government. So Pakistan, where you have a military that dominates the government, as happens in other parts of the world.
As happens in Egypt and as happened in Turkey for a while.
It has. In Turkey, it's gone down, but for quite some time, the military was dominant. That's one interesting thing about Afghanistan, is the military has never been a dominant institution politically.
But the Taliban is maintaining a large standing army, a large military.
They are, but the interesting thing is it doesn't seem to be an institutionalized army. That's the interesting thing to look at it. There's no general staff. There's no, it's, if you will, it's almost a super militia. And
And perhaps, sorry, please complete.
No, but one of the reasons for that is means that uh, the military has never been set up in Afghanistan to play politics. That could change, but the fact is the Taliban has simply augmented what they had when they took over. But I don't see them building up the military as an institution. Even the Soviets and the Americans, who spent years and billions of dollars building up the institution, never quite succeeded in giving it a permanence. I doubt that the Taliban would be able to do that either.
You mentioned that there has never been a decisive battle for Kabul. The
Mhm.
military just melts away. You mentioned it in our last conversation. And is that likely to be the case yet again?
Well, it that's the case for any government. Every government, particularly insurgency, that comes to power in Afghanistan, always believes it's there forever. But if they look behind, every regime, every one of their predecessors has collapsed. And the troops that supported those regimes collapsed with it. And when there was a complaint by Biden about the United States had put so much effort into building an Afghan army and it just collapsed, my immediate thought was, yeah, when was the last time this had happened in Afghanistan? And I thought, ask Mullah Omar exactly 20 years before. His Taliban army deserted as the Americans invaded. And if I thought back a little bit more, I could go back to 2000, 2002, when the communist regime collapsed without fighting to defend Kabul. It just dissolved. That this is a pattern in Afghanistan. And the danger for a Taliban regime is if their real trouble is will any group stand up for it if it looks like they're on their way out? And that's a danger of any regime, that particularly one that presumes it can do anything because where are my enemies? We are stronger than them. But if you looked at every one of the enemies that brought down the regime, none of them looked like they had the capacity to do it until it happened.
Yeah.
So
You mentioned in the past that Pakistan is a military with a country. Egypt is also a military with a country. Afghanistan is a country without an institutionalized military. Governments try to build one, but inevitably fail.
it's
And
yeah, it's it's almost as if when you come to power, particularly if you come to power as an insurgency, that the
Mhm.
first thing you want to do is build an army that looks like a state so that people think you're a state. And I think, as we talked about a little bit, the Taliban had a military parade in Bagram where they looked exactly like the Republic's troops because they were dressed in American uniforms. They rode around Humvees. But as one of my Afghan friends commented when I said, gee, why do they do this in Kabul? Why do they do it in Bagram? Said they didn't have enough petrol to take all that equipment to Kabul. So all they did was essentially drive 300 meters around the airfield, get the photo op, and that but it was interesting that that's how they were showing off. One could also say that they didn't come to power as a conventional army, and you would have thought, if we can do it, can somebody else do it? But every group that's come to power, for some ways, it's a desire to be a state, even though states in Afghanistan over the past 100 years have a dismal record of collapsing. But every
yeah,
state that's come into power believes it's an exception to the rule.
understood. Now, let's talk about. We've talked about the external pressures: no money, no recognition, hostile neighbors. Let's talk about the internal tensions in Afghanistan, because you were explaining them last time. And I'm sure our viewers would love to get a handle on them.
Well, if we look at the internal tensions, what we're seeing is a regime that came to power when one collapsed. It wasn't that it won people over with an ideology or converted. It moved into the palace and now it's the government. Um, but its policies have been quite radical and to some extent not designed to bring stability to the country. Um, Afghanistan has always seen itself, its population has seen itself as Islamic. So to say that we're going to run under Sharia law, every government in Afghanistan except the communist has said, yeah, we do Sharia law too. Um, but the difficulty of what the Taliban has been doing is two things. Number one, their really outrageous policies against women are out of sync with the rest of the Muslim world, even Saudi Arabia. But it's a tremendous hit to the Afghan economy. Afghanistan does not have enough educated people, right, to give away the resources of half of your population. Um, and the number of girls who went to school during the past 20 years is quite large. It's not like in the 1990s when the numbers were fewer, and many families have been dependent upon their wives or their daughters working. They support families, right? Uh, so this has been a hit. But the other thing too is, while the Taliban says it's an Islamic regime, it's an Islamic emirate, um, their high positions, their top positions, almost all of them have gone to Pashtuns. So to some extent, they have this ethnic exclusivity. And the Pashtuns, they've never done a proper census in Afghanistan. So it's always a guess as to whether a plurality or majority. Pashtuns claim they're a majority, but they're probably a plurality. But nevertheless, the government, the Taliban government, is almost exclusively Pashtun. And if you're a victor, you should be reaching out to the other ethnic groups, including those that joined you at the end of the war. They joined you ideologically. And the
Mm.
question begins to come up, what happens to the other regions of the country, the North, the West in particular, that are non-Pashtun, that feel they're not getting a fair percentage? I mean, they were Talibs, but they're not being invited in to take part in the government, let alone all the people that did not like the Taliban government and still do not like the Taliban. But I think a bigger potential problem is Afghanistan has one of the youngest populations in the world. I believe close to 2/3 is under 25 or 30. That's a very large population. And those people feel that their economic and social possibilities have been, if not terminated, greatly hurt by the Taliban. And the Taliban have provided no substitute for those people. At which point um, could you see, if not an uprising, uh, opposition exploding in that group that feels that it has nothing to lose? Again, it's easy to keep stability as long as people aren't pushed to the wall, but people have been pushed to the wall. And if things begin to break down along region, ethnic lines, and I think also on the basis of age, the Taliban could find themselves in a very difficult position. Uh, Most regimes in Afghanistan, there hasn't been any opposition to them until something really happens and then it grows. And I think the Taliban are in a position now where they inherited power, but the question is, can they preserve it? Particularly because they're now ruling a country, unlike the 1990s, in which Kabul, other major cities, there's an urban population that's not sympathetic to the Taliban cause. They're the ones that are most impacted by this. And if trouble were to break out in the cities, how would the Taliban handle it?
Now, you just mentioned that the Pashtuns control everything, and even within the Pashtuns, apparently there are rivalries. Kabul is run by Zadrans, who are Pashtun chieftains. They are not mullahs, and they are open to negotiation. They didn't buy into the Taliban dictum that women should not get an education. And in fact, in a gender segregated society, you do need women doctors. So the Taliban regime is going even against conservative Afghan traditions. Um, you pointed out that this regime is um, even more conservative than the one in the 1990s. Now, once we know that, then what are the chances of the internal Pashtun uh, coalition fracturing?
I believe it's always been fractured, even under the Republic. You know, it was
Hmm.
fractured. Um, non-Pashtuns see the Pashtuns as a cohesive group. They say they dominate everything. But if you talk to Pashtuns, they say, no, we don't. It's some other Pashtun group that does. Um, and the interesting thing about Afghanistan, unlike, let's say, the former Yugoslavia, is that every ethnic group has allies in other ethnic groups that are willing to join them if the conditions are right. So there's no ethnic solidarity that it's a Pashtun or nobody. It's
Not yet. Not yet. I mean, part of the perils of modernization have been mobilization along ethnic lines around the world.
it has, but as Ashraf Ghani discovered, uh, Afghan ethnic groups are pre-modern. They believe in a multi-ethnic state.
Hmm.
Their argument over who's going to be dominant in a multi-ethnic state, not who's going to be exclusive in a multi-ethnic state, which is why we don't see policies of ethnic cleansing in Afghanistan. We see politics of ethnic domination.
What
Uh,
about the Hazaras? There are arguments and allegations that what they are going through is probably some form of ethnic cleansing
well, it's they suffer the most, but on the other
because
hand,
they are Shias and they are close to
well,
Iran.
they're Shias, they're close politically, to Iran, but it's also the type of thing that, um, in terms of territory, they suffered much more in the late 19th century from this under Mir Abdurrahman, well before where their lands were actually taken. Um, in these situations, if you've got maybe 25% of the population of Kabul that's Hazara, um, that's a more difficult thing to deal with. But what I would say is in some cases, what we don't see is the desire or the push. There are some Hazaras, expatriates that are doing this, that we should have independent countries. The interesting thing about Afghanistan is no matter how bad it gets, a solution of breaking up the country is never on the table because people think that would be worse. And so if you look at the Hazarajat, even if it was to be independent, you would have a double landlocked nation. Um, but also, what would you do with the Hazaras that are in the cities? So, in some ways, what all these ethnic groups, they may not like the situation or the current borders of Afghanistan. They all have historical complaints and legitimate ones against each other. When it comes down to negotiating for the future, they're able to come to an agreement because, again, there's no ethnic group that's so solid that it doesn't have a faction that's willing to betray it if the conditions are right.
So an urban uprising is a real possibility. Kabul has 4 million people and 20,000 Talibs, and these Talibs are mainly outsiders.
That's a possibility. I mean, police forces are designed in New York, Paris, London. They have about 25,000 police in those. They are designed to maintain order on a regular basis. They are not designed to put down insurgencies. Ask the French about Paris. Okay, when Paris becomes revolutionary, you don't send in the police, and Paris usually becomes independent at that time. The thing about Afghanistan,
Hmm.
that like Paris or like Tehran, um, is Kabul is a primate city. What happens in Kabul tends to set the national agenda. And so a major shift of power in Kabul uh, could bring a government down regardless of how much support you had in Kandahar or Jalalabad.
So you said last time in Afghanistan, the perception of power is power. No one backs a loser. People turn against the ruler the moment he's seen as weak. Are we at a point where the Taliban is being seen as weak?
Not yet, no. Um,
Okay.
Usually when that happens, it's also a crisis. It's how well do you do in a crisis? For example, when the Soviet Union pulled out of Afghanistan in 1989, Najib was perceived of as weak. And the Mujahideen said, this is the time to move. And Pakistani ISI said, attack Jalalabad, capture a city. Then we can move on Kabul. But Najib defended Jalalabad. The city didn't fall. 3,000 Mujahideen were killed. And with that victory, or Mujahideen loss, his stock went up. It was maybe he isn't a loser. Even with the Soviets gone, it looks like he can hold on. It was only when the
And he
Soviet
and he did hold on. He
he
did
did
hold on
hold
for
on
a
until
while,
after till the Soviet
much
Union
more than
collapsed.
Ashraf Ghani.
Yes, number one, he didn't run. He was there for he was going to stick it out. He knew how to play Afghan politics, and even though he was running a much more unpopular regime, uh, but that when the perception, and even Mullah Omar, um, it's there weren't very many foreign troops on the ground. Um, it was only when Mazar Sharif fell, a couple of places, and then Kabul was abandoned. Then there's realization the Taliban can't hold on. And you did not find anywhere die-hard Taliban saying, we'll fight to the end. Those people fled to Pakistan. The only people that fought for the Taliban to the end were foreign fighters, I would say, because they didn't know any better.
So that's very interesting. You've also mentioned in the past that Afghanistan is a place where new and interesting things happen. And neither the communists nor the mullahs were part of the Afghan tradition. And yet, both of them have ruled the country by now.
They have. That's one of the reasons that I say Afghanistan is not a graveyard of empires, but it is a graveyard of analysts. Looking backwards and saying this is what's going to happen is almost always going to be wrong, because whatever happens in Afghanistan takes people by surprise. I would have never predicted that a communist regime would happen in Afghanistan. There's no country that was least open to socialism than Afghanistan. But there you have it, it happened. Similarly, while Afghanistan is one of the most Islamic countries in the world, it has never been ruled by mullahs, by religious people, never. And we got the Taliban. The republic is established by an American invasion, and the Afghans didn't fight the American invasion initially. They said, welcome foreigners. You got rid of the Taliban, you got rid of Pakistan. Now that didn't last, but George Bush wouldn't have predicted that. Said, oh, any foreigners there, the Afghans will fight. Well, only if they got a reason. And that took people by surprise. Again, the collapse of the Kabul government. If Najib survived the withdrawal of the Soviet Union, I believe if the Americans had handled the withdrawal more astutely, we'd still have a republic in Afghanistan, right? Ashraf Ghani was the wrong leader for that. America needed its own Najib. Is like somebody that had credibility within Afghanistan, that they might not be sure you were going to hold on, but you could give them a reason to think that you could. Because American arms, American money would have continued if an Afghan government had persisted. But, Ghani
So,
cut and run.
so forgive me for asking an obvious question. Why was Ashraf Ghani the wrong man? And was Hamid Karzai also the wrong man?
No, whether it's the British, the Soviets, or the Americans, every foreign country that's invaded Afghanistan has always wanted a weak leader when it comes in, because it won't give you trouble. But when you decide to withdraw from Afghanistan, you have to have a leader that has enough respect among the Afghan people that he could survive without you, without foreigners on the ground. He may need your money, he may need your arms, but you need a person that has confidence in himself and figures, I know how to rule Afghanistan when the foreigners that put me in power leave. One of the interesting things Najib did was immediately abandon the Communist Party, call it a nationalist party, and say we have nothing to do with socialism. Now Gorbachev was in sync with that, but that that was a total rethinking of how we need to run the government once the Soviets go.
And yet, within 3 months of the Soviet Union collapsing, Muhammad Najibullah's regime fell. It just ran out of money.
Listen, if your foundation crumbles, the house goes with it. All right. Uh,
And the foundation for every Afghanistan government in the recent past has been external resources. Money
it,
has come in from outside to Afghanistan's rulers, who've then distributed some of it and secured their regime.
yes, but after the Civil War in 1929, um, King Zahir Shah and his father, plus their relatives, 50 years of peace in Afghanistan. They also depended upon outside money. They got money from both the Soviets and the Americans. They got
Mm.
money from the UN. They built up an army, but they never used it. So, for those people that say Afghanistan can never become stable, King Zahir Shah's government was actually empirically quite weak, but it
Mm.
had no challengers, and it it lasted. Gave Afghanistan 50 years of peace and stability. His cousin Dawood, who became president in a military coup, his regime was stable, except that the communists had realized, if you do a military coup, we could come to power that way, and they took him out that way. Uh, but if you look at it for 50 years, there was a government that declared itself to be all powerful, but never did anything to offend the people inside Afghanistan. It was modern for the people in Kabul. It was conservative for the people in Kandahar. Um, it had a shiny army that marched in the annual military parade, but it went back to barracks. They never used tanks. They never used MiGs to attack the Afghan people. They had a gendarmerie, modeled off the Italians and the French, that handled internal security, but they were very, very careful to cut deals with people rather than play a zero-sum game. And ever since the communists came in, Afghanistan, unfortunately, has zero-sum politics. We're the winners, you're the losers. We don't compromise with anybody. And what that 50 years of stability showed is if you compromise, you don't have to do it formally, but if you come to an accommodation with the people around you, you can get stability in Afghanistan.
So
And
as usual, we can blame the communists.
yeah, they're kind of extinct, but so they're easy to blame. Even Putin, who didn't like to see the Soviet Union gone, didn't bring back communism. He brought back the Orthodox priests and the czars. I mean, um,
He is a czar now, pretty much.
he is a czar, not a commissar. But
So let's talk about Habibullah Kalakani, a Tajik derogatively called Bachai Sakau, if I'm getting the name correct.
yes,
Uh,
son of a water carrier. Yes, yes.
yeah, we're son of a water carrier, and he ruled Afghanistan
Nine
in
months, yes.
yeah
1920.
1929 from January 17 to October 13.
Yes.
But he was overthrown when he ran out of money. So is US President Donald Trump just going to cut out the money going to the Taliban? Should the Taliban worry?
The Taliban should worry not because he has a strong strategic sense of how Afghanistan works, um, but because he's a mercurial person that doesn't like to spend money on foreigners. So he could easily cut all the money from Afghanistan because it doesn't care. Um, could that bring down the Taliban regime? It could. Probably create immense suffering for the Afghan people too. But the problem is that the Taliban believe they were happy to see him come back into power because they got a great deal out of Doha. Um, what they don't understand is that that great deal was because he didn't care about Afghanistan and he wanted to get out. Um, but one of the first statements that he made on Afghanistan is he wants all of our arms, $9 billion in military equipment back. Um, And I don't think they expected that. Um, that's something that I and my colleague Naman Najumi also championed in this white paper that we wrote, but more as a negotiating position, that building up an army.
Well, you have something in common with Donald Trump, Thomas. There you go.
Yes, even a stop clock tells time twice exactly every day. Um, you know, but it is the type of thing that what kind of leverage a military that you cannot afford will not bring stability to the regime that you've got. It will merely hasten its downfall because you won't have any assets to replace the international aid if it goes. And the problem of dealing with someone like Donald Trump um, is if the Taliban think they're tough, he will try to prove he's tougher. But the bigger thing is he simply does not care about Afghanistan. And if it's a regime, you have no leverage over people that really don't care what happens to you or your future. So for them, I would say he's really potentially quite dangerous. But again, not because he or his allies have thought this through, but simply because just knowing his predilections, um, aid could suddenly be cut off, and that sort of puts you in an Najibullah position in a way that even though formally aid was cut off, the Biden administration was helpful to the Taliban. It did not
Well,
support.
India supplied 50,000 tons of wheat, and the World Bank was doing its bit. I'm sure Pakistan did its bit. I'm sure other neighbors, Uzbekistan has been giving free electricity. So Afghanistan has got by.
It's got by, but how many poles can you pull away before things topple? The U.S. has always been a major contributor, even if it's running through the UN. They've been major contributors. Uh, Also, I don't know whether India will get involved in, well, India will not be probably involved in this, but Pakistan has actually been meeting with, in Tajikistan, representatives of the Afghan resistance. One of the great ironies is maybe they'll support a new insurgency against the government that they put into power. But the bigger thing is the United States has not supported a potential insurgency. It's been very cold to that. That's something that could also change. Um, Again, there's a lot of uncertainty that's happening in Afghanistan now, but Afghanistan is more vulnerable than it looks, simply because it's in a weakened state, and the Taliban may not care, and they have enough money to run it right now. Um, but there comes a question of if things collapse more, can you make will your own group, will the Taliban itself split between those that say being hostile or causing problems for the world is actually a problem for our regime. And I would look for it's since I don't know enough about what the Taliban are up to internally. Um, there's always a possibility of internal splits saying we need to cut a deal with these different countries. Uh, Forget about some of these anti-women problems because it's not a popular issue in Afghanistan, and it threatens our stability. So I would be looking within the Taliban to what extent do they see that there's a danger of collapse, and what do they need to do to prevent it?
Now, you mentioned Afghanistan is in a weakened state. It is also true that Pakistan is in a weakened state. Pakistan has been going to the IMF time and
Right.
again with a begging bowl for money, and it has been getting that money primarily because it's a nuclear power. And just as Afghanistan has the Pashtun problem, Pakistan has the Punjab problem, even though, of course, as we discussed last time, um, both Egypt and Pakistan are descendants of Mamluk states in some ways. They're Ishtiaq Ahmed wrote a book called The Garrison State. And having said that, um, could Pakistan implode? And if so, do we see a Pakhtunistan? And is there a possibility of a of reconstruction of the medieval state of Khorasan if the modern nation state
Well,
experiment fails.
it is a possibility that one of the problems is that for Afghanistan's point of view, they've always been in favor of an independent Pashtunistan, but it's been within Pakistan territory. And I think there'd be a great fear, even among the Taliban, for a greater Pashtun state because they would be a minority within it. There's more Pashtuns in Pakistan. They're better educated and they're wealthier. To what extent would Pakistan, I mean, would a Pashtunistan find the Pashtuns in Afghanistan the tail that they're going to add to their dog? If that's the case, then I could see the rest of Afghanistan breaking off and forming a Khorasan. Is like, as I've told you, one of the great things about having the term Khorasan is that it's a non-ethnic term and it has a good heritage, which is one of the reasons the Islamic State stole it as their designation of Islamic State of Khorasan province. But it's useful because in Afghanistan, just calling it Afghanistan has ethnic connotations, which causes no ends of difficulty. Countries like America and Canada, to some extent, are blessed by the fact that there is no Mr. America or Ms. Canada, of which we are all descended. It's a made-up name for a made-up people, although we have a tremendous amount of solidarity because we can define it any way we like it. The problem of countries with ethnic names is they actually involve real people, and some of whom see themselves as real X's and the others not. And so I think Afghanistan was more stable before the age of nationalism because it always thought of itself as multi-ethnic. It had ruling dynasties that were Turk, Iranian, Mongol, Pashtun, but the place itself was always heterogeneous. And one of the problems of nation states, particularly ethnic nation states, is they have a problem of defining insiders and outsiders. And historically, Central Asia that was not a problem. You know, there are no insiders and outsiders. It's just us and who's going to be ruling the place. That changed, but the people did not.
Yeah, but here's the question for you. There is indeed a movement now um, along ethnic lines around the world in some
Mm-hmm.
ways.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, the Tajiks in Afghanistan may feel they have nothing in common with the Tajiks in Tajikistan. Similarly, the Uzbeks in Afghanistan may feel there's nothing in common with Uzbeks in Uzbekistan, and so on and so forth. But say the Pashtuns in Pakistan and the Pashtuns in Afghanistan. And Afghan, of course, is another name for a Pashtun. It's what they use the term interchangeably, as you said. Then what happens to the entire political arrangement of not just South Asia, but also Central Asia?
Well, we're still dealing with the reformation of that under the Soviet Union created ethnic republics, and
Mm.
Stalin was commissar of minorities, and he did that deliberately because he divided the natural regions of Central Asia between ethnic republics so that they really couldn't project power. So that it used to be Khiva, which was up by the Aral Sea. There was Bukhara, which was the Trans-Oxus, and there was Kokand, which is the Fergana Valley. Those places are integrated. They are multi-ethnic, but they're integrated economically. They're historically states. And the Soviet Union divided them up into ethnic republics. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, those ethnic boundaries, those ethnic republics remained. But if we look at it, those are not particularly natural regions. Could they break up? Possibly, but look at the colonial borders in sub-Saharan Africa. every sub-Saharan African ruler knows that those borders are artificial, that they were drawn by Europeans, but they had an agreement. We will not going to argue over this because there's no end to.
That's true, but Sudan has broken up into two,
But it's
and both Sudan and South Sudan have civil war.
that they have. But if we look at it, it's really still surprising how little has changed there, given
True,
that
but it hasn't been too long.
it hasn't been too long. What I've written in Afghanistan is don't look at the nations, look at the regions. Afghanistan
Mm.
has Western Afghanistan, Herat, Northern Afghanistan, Mazar Balk, Kabul and Peshawar used to be a dyad, Kandahar was there. And these are the ancient Persian provinces, 5th century BC provinces of the Iranian Empire. In some cases, they've been all parts of Afghanistan have all been part of one empire. In other places, particularly the Mughals and the Safavids and the Uzbek, Afghanistan was a frontier that divided between them. With
And Mughals came down from
and the
modern
Mughals,
day
Mughals came down from Samarkand.
Fergana. Yes,
Yeah,
Samarkand.
yeah, they came down. But if you look at it, what you can see is that over time, these pieces are perpetual. The states that they're part of change. Now, there's a conservatism about breaking up states, I would say, in the modern world. Um, but
May
if you're
not last, given what we are seeing.
what we're still seeing
Greenland
crisis,
could be yours.
well, maybe the Vikings have a better claim than, although the indigenous people would say the Vikings were invaders too. But if we look at some of these, yeah, let me just start back. Is that if we look a lot of the crisis in the Middle East that we're seeing, I think future historians will say are the aftershocks of the division of the Ottoman Empire.
Oh, well, I'm not just future historians. I think
Right.
most political analysts say that.
And looking at the way Britain left India, we're still dealing with aftershocks of that, and we're dealing with the aftershocks of that colonial empire. So the question is, what comes after? Um, is I think, I will leave it to a 22nd century historian to explain why it went in this direction. But the beliefs of every ruler of a nation state is that we've been here forever and we'll stay here forever. Um, Historically is not particularly well grounded, but the price of breakup is incredibly high. So what's going to happen? I don't know. I am concerned when Putin invades Ukraine that we're back to a period of reorganization of territories, which we last saw in the 19th century, and that did not lead to good things.
All right. So, bringing it back to Afghanistan, on the whole, you'd expect Afghanistan to hold together simply because it is not exactly an ethnically pure state. People want, every ethnicity wants to be, or let's say some ethnicities want to be the dominant ethnicity in the state, and they're all fractured. And the big risk to Afghanistan comes from economic collapse and urban discontent. Have I got that correct, Thomas?
That's what I would say. I mean, when things collapse, people do tend to organize on the basis of ethnic group. All right. So we say,
Mm.
it's ethnicity. But if we look at it, no ethnic group in Afghanistan has developed a nationalist ideology. That's the really interesting thing is that
Not
Afghan
even the Tajiks.
no. The Tajiks is no one ever uses the term Tajik inside Afghanistan, right?
What do
That's
they
actually
use?
they will define themselves locally. I'm a Panjshiri, I'm a Badakhshi, I'm a Harati, I'm a Kabuli.
Mm.
Um, it's outsiders that say, "Oh, you're all Tajiks." Well, what does somebody in Badakhshan have in common with somebody in Herat? They're Persian speakers. They're Sunni. We can we in opposition to other groups. You can define them. But no ethnic politician in Afghanistan has ever laid the groundwork for creating an ethnic nation state. As I wrote him, this was like 20, 25 years ago, Afghanistan is a land of arranged marriages, and nationalism is a romantic enterprise. Afghans never divorce, not because they love their spouses, because the family is too important to allow it. So that's what I say, is that it takes a certain amount of romance to believe in nationalism. And the Afghans, they're romantic in their poetry, but not necessarily in their marriages.
There we go. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Thomas Baranga, do buy his latest book, Shadow Empires. It promises to be a riveting read. And we'll have you back, Thomas. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you very much.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.